Hey online family, I'm Tiffany and I want to welcome you to our online service. In just a few minutes, we are going to worship together and then begin a new series through the book of Ruth with Pastor John. But before we do, I wanted to let you all know that this past week, we sent out an online survey that Matt told you about a couple weeks ago. For those of you who have filled out our online connection card to let us know that you're a part of our online family, we sent you an email with a link to an online survey. This survey will help us figure out how we can best shepherd you and learn what your needs are and why you tune in every single week. If you received that email, we would really appreciate if you took some time this week to fill it out. And if you didn't receive the email but would like to fill out this online survey, make sure you take some time to go to ucov.com/online, fill out that online connection card, and indicate that you regularly attend our online services. Then we will make sure to get you that survey this week. Thanks so much. Now, here's what's coming up at our church. We first want to say thank you to everyone who was involved with Breakaway. We had the opportunity to share the gospel with so many kids. We saw our youth and our church lead and grow, and we got to celebrate all that God is doing with our entire church family. So much work went into Breakaway, and we just can't thank our church family enough for being invested in the next generation. So thank you. We also want to remind you that this Sunday after our live services, we will be having a lunch reception for two of our global workers from Central Asia, Rodney and Sandy Letts. This lunch will be in the UCC Youth Center at 12:30 p.m., hosted by our Global Outreach team. We would love for you to come and hear about what Rodney and Sandy are doing, take some time to pray over them and their mission. We really hope to see you there. You know, as a church family, one way that we serve each other is through prayer. Whether you attend all the time or maybe you're watching for the very first time, we would love to pray for you. So if you would like for us to partner with you in prayer, or maybe even celebrate with you in a praise, simply go to ucov.com/prayer, write out your prayer request or your praise, and know that our prayer team would welcome the opportunity to pray for you during the week. Thank you again for being here with us online. As we continue in our service, would you please join me in prayer? God, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this online family and to gather and to watch and to hear your word from wherever that we are at. God, I just pray that wherever we're watching from, that you would open our hearts, open our minds, open our ears to hear from you as Pastor John speaks. God, thank you for our church family. Thank you for everything that you are doing in our church. We're just so blessed to be able to serve you and to serve alongside our brothers and sisters in Christ. We invite you into our places wherever we are watching or listening, and we thank you for who you are. In Jesus' name, amen.
You are here, moving in the midst. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you, I worship you. You are waymaker, miracle work, promise keep, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. You are waymaker, miracle work, promise keep, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. You are here, touching every heart. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, healing every heart. I worship you, I worship you. it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop
Declare that with us, come on.
Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop, you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. Yes it is, you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. Oh, that is who you are. 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 Oh, that is who you are. That is who you are.
Hey, University Covenant Church, Pastor John here, and I'm super excited. We are going to start a new series starting today in the book of Ruth. But before we get there, I wanted to share a few things. One is that if you are a contributor, a donor, a giver, a tither to University Covenant Church, in the coming week, you should receive a giving statement in your email. I just want to say thank you. Our church's fiscal year ends in June, so we just finished the fiscal year, and while we're still putting the numbers together, it looks like we're ending in the black, and that's a beautiful thing. So I want to thank you for your generosity. And as we start this new budget cycle, we're just so excited about what God has ahead. One of the things that we're super excited about is a renewed emphasis on our life groups, our small groups. Small groups are groups of usually anywhere from 5 to 12 people that meet together. Most groups meet weekly, some groups meet every other week, for really three things. The first is some form of Bible study, reading and applying God's word together. For friendship, forming bonds and community and familial relationships. And the third is prayer, praying for one another and being in the know. It's our primary way in our church for people to really form friendships, get to know one another, have support, receive care. And in the fall, we're going to start a life group, what we're calling a life group campaign. We're going to be actually going through the whole Gospel of John in the coming school year. But the first 8 weeks of that, we're going to be doing that together. Our life groups will be looking through that book together. Our sermons will be on that as well. And we'll have many other resources, special curriculum as well. And one of the things we're wondering is if you're not in a group, would you be interested in being in one? And if you're not in a group, would you be really interested in leading one or facilitating one? You may actually have some friends you know who aren't connected, and you thought, man, it'd be fun to get these friends together and lead a group. So we want to know if you're interested or if you're interested in leading one. And so we're going to put a link here on the screen to fill out this form. Maybe we'll put a QR code as well. If you would just fill this out if you're interested in being in a group, and we'll try to connect you with the right group. And you'll see an opportunity there to start a group as well. And we'd love to follow up with you. We'll provide training and so on. We're really looking forward to that. The idea is that we're better together. The deeper our love for one another, the deeper our community is for one another, the better witness we are in our community, the more effect we have for positive impact through God's involvement in our life, in our community as well. Now, we're starting the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is in the Old Testament. And we're going to do something a little different this morning or this day, whenever you're watching this, as we prepare for Ruth. We're actually going to look in the book of Judges. And here's why. The first words in the book of Ruth are this: in the days when the judges ruled. You know, when you read a story or a fairy tale, you know, it'll say something like once upon a time. This book, the book of Ruth, the opening statement is in the days when the judges ruled. This story that we're about to get into happens in a context in the history of Israel that's really important to understand, because really it's a chaotic time in the history of Israel. So the days when the judges ruled, why don't we look in the book of Judges to find out what we're talking about? What does it look like when the judges ruled? Because when we understand this, we understand a lot of what's going to come in the book of Ruth. So if you have your Bibles, or it will be on the screen, we're going to read Judges chapter 2, starting with verse 8. And it goes like this: Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. Here's the key part. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. We'll talk about that in a moment. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, here's the connection with Ruth, who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned away from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and their stubborn ways. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation had violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors, and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did. The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. We have a really interesting situation here as we open up the book of Ruth next week, and that in the time of Judges reflects a time in Israel's history. Now, just as a reminder, the books of the Old Testament up until this point have been really about God rescuing the Israelites out of slavery from Egypt. He rescued them in miraculous ways. I mean, ways that you would look back and say, God, this was you. And maybe you have times in your life where you can look back and say, God, this was you. The Israelites as a nation had that over and over again. They were rescued out of slavery. They spent 40 years in the wilderness, and it was a flimsy time for them, but God was incredibly faithful to them, serving them food miraculously, serving them water miraculously. And then he brings them into the promised land and brings up this leader named Joshua. And the goal was that they would drive out these nations that were corrupt, that were evil, so that this new nation would be formed that would be a light to other nations. And miracle after miracle, battle after battle, God came through Joshua's leadership. And they begin to enter the promised land and slowly drive out the nations that were there before them that were really corrupting society. It was just a story of God's continued faithfulness to a people. And this people saw God firsthand. It was clear as day. There was no doubt God is at work. But what we learn in these verses that we just read is that after Joshua died, it only took a couple generations, just a couple generations, for people to know nothing about God or what he did for Israel. This is crazy to me that in spite of decades of faithfulness that God has given to generations of the Israelites, it only took a couple generations for this new generation to know nothing about God and to know really nothing about God's saving acts in their history. And in a couple generations, all faith in God was absolutely lost. It's crazy to me. But it also reveals, as I think about our own day and age, that most of us, well, I want to paint two categories. Most of us who are parents or grandparents have a hope that either our kids or our grandkids will inherit the faith we have in God. That whatever we've experienced with God, we really hope that for our kids. We really hope that for our grandkids. That's one category. There's another category that all of us are part of a church family, a spiritual family, that when God adopts us into his family, we actually have new relatives. And if there isn't, there ought to be this sense of, I really hope that the future generations in our church inherit or have the same faith that we do. It could be our youth groups, our children's ministry. If you're older, maybe college or young adult. The idea is we should share a common burden, no matter what our age, of who's coming after us and what are we doing so that they might also have the same faith in God that we do. There's this burden. But this passage that we just read should be somewhat disturbing. And what I want to do in our time together is talk about 4 insights we learn about passing on our faith to future generations, whether that be biological future generations or spiritual future generations in our own church. There are some insights that you and I gain from the book of Judges about how this doesn't go very well. And after we do that, I want to transition to talking about what are 4 practices that we can practice together that you can practice in your own life that, while not guaranteeing the next generation will have your faith in God, certainly stacks the deck in our favor, certainly stacks the deck, not death, in our favor as well when it comes to passing on our faith. So let's first talk about 4 insights from Judges about passing on our faith. Now, to set this up, we probably need to define what faith means. If we want to pass something on, it might be good to define what faith means. The root of the word faith means to trust. So what we're talking about is passing on our trust in God. But another way of describing trust is this. I'm going to put this on the screen because I really want you to remember this. Another definition of trust is this: who or what is most important to us? Who or what absorbs our hearts and our imagination? Who or what we seek to give us fulfillment? This really is what faith is about. It's a trust, and all of us have this sense of trust in a person or a thing, a what, that we see as most important to us, that really absorbs our thoughts and our hearts and our imagination. And it's something or someone that we give ourselves to and trust for fulfillment, for satisfying our greatest needs. And so we learn that in the book of Judges, we have 4 insights about the passing on of this. And then again, we'll end with what are some 4 practices that we could all practice to pass on our faith in God to the next generation. Faith, as we describe it, is consuming. It's not just an intellectual belief, but it affects all of who we are. It affects our day-to-day living. It's something that consumes us so much that it's lived out. It's a belief that ignites, that pushes us into action and affects our life decision. So here's the first insight we get from the book, the verses here in the book of Judges about passing on faith to the next generations. Here's the first one, and it's super disturbing, and here it is. It's not automatic. It's not automatic. We learn from the book of Judges that just because there was a history of generations of people having faith in God does not mean that it's automatic that this faith will be transferred to future generations. You know, if you have kids, if you have biological kids, there are some things that you could probably assume that your kids are going to get certain traits from you or your spouse, father or mother, that there's going to be some things that come along. When I saw my kids, it was very easy over time to say, that trait, those eyes are from me. That trait, those ears are from my wife, and so on. And it's automatic. Without much effort, your kids or your grandkids are going to inherit certain biological traits from you. I would like to believe that the same is true spiritually, but we learn in the book of Judges that that's not the case, that actually there's really no guarantee and there's no automatic process where people will inherit your faith. This goes for your biological family, but it also goes for your spiritual family. Let's say that right now that we are living a vital life with God. Let's just say our church is living in its ideal, of fully living a vibrant, wonderful faith in God that has ramifications in all our life. Here's the bad news. We can come back a generation or two later and visit this church of ours, and it may not be guaranteed. We're only a couple generations away from extinction in our faith. That's a scary thought, but it's helpful to understand that in spite of all that God has done, in spite of all the history of God's investment, faith transference is not automatic. Now, here's something important to understand that leads to the second insight that I want you to understand, is that even though faith is automatic, faith in God is not automatic, here's what is true, is that faith does transfer to something else, and that's the second point. Another way of saying it is, while faith in God is not automatic, faith is automatic. In other words, the future generations will put their faith in something. Here's another way of saying this, that all of us are people of faith. And when people lose their faith in God, it doesn't mean they lose faith. They just transfer that faith to something else. If faith is something that absorbs us, faith is something that we put our trust in, faith is something that we believe will fulfill our needs, all of us are people of faith, and all of us put our time into something or someone we think will fulfill that. If you believe that finding the love of your life is what really brings full fulfillment, you're going to put your faith into trying to find a spouse. If you believe that career satisfaction is what brings you fulfillment, you're going to put your faith in your career. If you believe that being loved and known by friends is what really brings life, you're going to put faith in that. You're going to be absorbed by that, put your efforts into that. If you believe that having things or having money is what really brings the freedom to have true life, you're going to put your faith in that. In other words, we are all people of faith. It's not that we lose our faith in God and no longer have faith. What it is we lose our faith in God and transfer that faith into something or someone else. We see this in the book of Judges. Judges chapter 2, verse 12. It says, they forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who brought them out of Egypt. But notice the next sentence. They followed and worshiped various gods of the people around them. So it wasn't that they lost faith. They just lost faith in God and put faith into the gods of the culture around them. Now, this is very interesting. The prominent god of the Canaanites during that time was the god of Baal. You'll hear the god Baal come up a lot. Baal was a fertility god or a rain god in a very agricultural environment. Rain and avoiding famine was a huge thing. And so there was a belief in Baal as someone who brought the rains, but it really brought into fertility in general. So not only was it crops, but it was animals as well, where animals reproduce, but it was also human fertility. Will we have kids? Will we have healthy kids? And all those things were centered in a God named Baal. And if we worshiped him and gave our attention to him, then he would provide what we need for rain, for fertility for animals, and for fertility in our kids as well. So there were temples dedicated to Baal. Now, what was interesting is some of the ways that you got Baal's attention were through doing rituals in the temple, including sexual rituals. So the idea was if Baal is a god of fertility, we must practice certain fertilities in the temple. And so there'd be temple prostitutes, sexual rituals that you would practice in the temple. In addition, there was actually human sacrifice that was done in the temple as well. And again, all this was to kind of sway Baal's heart so that he would be a god of fertility and to bless the crops and the blessed fertility of animals and humanity. And so what was interesting is that people transferred their faith into God of Israel to the God of Baal and put their efforts into that. Now, in our own day, it's just helpful to understand. I want to give some concepts here because all of us are guilty of worshiping and putting our faith in things other than God. And there's some trends or some similarities as to what put our faith in. When we talk about other gods, sometimes we think of, we don't worship idols or things that we hold, but we all are worshipers and we're all likely to worship something. And here's some commonalities of things that we're likely to worship. The first is this, is that it addresses a valid need. What we tend to worship actually promises a back end that is actually valid. Are you lonely? You're going to worship something that provides for that. Are you hungry? You're going to worship something that promises that. The end goal of what you worship is actually a God-felt need in terms of what you're trying to satisfy. Here's the second thing that's really interesting, is it's encouraged by your culture. So in the same way that the Israelites left the God of Israel and started worshiping Baal, it wasn't like they invented Baal. They just absorbed the gods of the culture around them. The same is true for us. We are, in any society that you're in, you breathe in a smog without realizing it, of promises. If you put your efforts here, if you put your faith here, if you're absorbed here, if you put all your attention and hope here, then you will be rewarded. So it's very important to understand whatever culture and era you're in, to step back and go, what are the idols? What are the gods of my culture that address or promise to address a valid need, but maybe do in a way that is half-hearted or doesn't really fulfill what we think? So the first thing about gods that we want to recognize is it addresses something you're really looking for. That's not a bad thing. It's encouraged by your culture. And the third is this, is often there's a quick initial reward. There's a quick initial reward. I'm going to show a commercial right now. I just looked on the internet for a recent commercial. It's 30 seconds long. And as you observe this commercial, I want you to ask, what is this product promising you? Does it address a valid need? And what is it they're saying that if you pursue will give you this valid need? Let's watch this commercial. Okay, a recent commercial on an electrical car. And notice what they promise. I just wrote down a few phrases here. They promise this. You will be electrified. You will be exuberant. You will be electrifying. You will be iconic. Now, all these are addressing this need to be liked and loved and powerful. All these are good things. Kind of, I want these things. And what will get you there? What's the one thing that if you do, you will get there? You'll have all these things. Here it is. Order your Lyric car. Get the car. And all that will be promised to you. And so what you want to understand is that it's fascinating watching commercials to ask, what are they trying to address? What valid need are they trying to address? And what's their promise? And so again, this addresses a valid need. It's encouraged by your culture, get the right car. It offers an initial reward. I bet you anything, if you buy this car, initially you will feel that way. You're gonna be driving your car and looking at all the fancy gadgets and go, man, I am electrifying. I am exuberant. I am iconic. But there's a blind corner. There's a paycheck that comes with all these things. And often the long-lasting promise doesn't really come through. It has a short life cycle. It has a blind corner where you turn the corner and go, oh, I didn't realize that the long-term result wasn't as satisfying. Here's another thing. Is short-term reward, long-term kind of disappointment. But often these idols or gods that we pursue require some type of ethical or moral sacrifice. So for example, in the worshiping of the Baal, it required sex in the temple, which for many people go, hey, great short-term reward, but you break some type of ethical thing, or human sacrifice. So I want you to understand that we all have a tendency to worship gods, but these gods all have a common theme of a promise to address a valid need, a short-term reward. It's encouraged by culture. Often the process requires some type of ethical compromise. And finally, it has a short life cycle, or there's a blind corner where you don't understand the full ramifications. It really doesn't address what you're looking for, only what God can do. Now, what would be something in our own culture? Now, there's the obvious things of materialism. That's a huge thing in our culture. Maybe career advancement, or in our own town, education advancement. All these things will say, hey, if I get this, maybe family, kids that succeed. Now, all these things are good, but when they become the center of hope that, man, if I just have this, everything will be okay, they begin to become false gods, and the promises that they promise don't end up being as fulfilling as you think they are. I want to share another, I'm going to go a little academic here, but I want to share another false god that's in our society right now. But there's a sense right now that says, if you are not happy, here's the problem, that you are not living your full, authentic self. This is called the worship, or the god of secular individualism. The idea is, the way that you're going to be healthy and happy is a very individualistic mindset. I need to be true to myself. And it's secular, that it has nothing to do with God. But what's unique about this idol is it's all about looking inside and being true to yourself. Now, there's been a lot of philosophy done this, but this idea of finding your authentic self by looking inside is a relatively new thing in world history. Let me explain. Throughout history, the way you lived your authentic self was actually much more in relationship to other people. You looked at your relationship to your family, your community, your relationship to God, and it was those things that provided a sense of identity. And only is it recently that we're looking and saying, what does it mean to be true to myself? Now, it's interesting. There's a Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor, and he says this. It's very interesting. He says, what's new about this is you go inward. You have to be true to your inward self. But he says that's an incredibly recent and fragile identity. It needs recognition, it needs affirmation, and you can never get enough. Now, traditional or historical society said that your identity was based on you being a citizen of a society, a family member, a believer in God. In other words, your identity is based on your connections to things outside yourself. He says that ends up being a much more stable identity than just looking inside. Now, here's the reality. Whatever you place your identity in is if it's not in God, is gonna have a negative effect. If it's just on who you are individually, you're gonna see some ramifications. It's gonna result in you being further and further isolated from your community. I think this is why we see more depression, more anxiety, and more shame, because the more and more we look inside alone for our sense of, this is where my happiness is going to come from. by default, it has less to do with those around you, and you're less likely to connect with those around you. And shame and depression and anxiety are all connected to isolation. And our idol, though it promises short-term satisfaction, I am this is how I identify myself. In long term, we're going to be more and more isolated, and it hurts. Now, I don't want to over-idealize traditional ways of affirmation of identity either, because that has its negatives as well. It could be pretty rigid. And so really what our deep longing for is to get our identity from a God who is always pursuing us, who never abandons us, who we can never fear will leave us. Anyway, that's just an example of something to be just aware of, that one of the subtle smogs we're breathing in right now is that your true happiness will be living your true self, and you're going to find your true self by looking inward. That's one of our idols right now. That was a lot, I know, but I just want us to think about this for our own lives in a way to kind of, in a godly way, analyze our own culture. What are people saying lead to true happiness? And in most cases, it will be a false God. And what we're trying to do is look for what only God can provide in these false promises. All these false promises have roots of goodness in them. Family's good, career's good, finding out how you're shaped is good. But when those become the thing that you look for to provide what only God can provide, there's going to be some disappointment. Okay, that was a long point. The first point was this, that faith transference is not automatic. But the second point is that, but it will transfer to something else. Here's the third thing. Faith cannot be borrowed. What strikes me in Judges chapter 2, verse 19, it says that when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than their ancestors. It's interesting that when God provided a faithful person to lead Israel, people's faith in God grew. But as soon as that person was gone, their faith deteriorated as well. In other words, their faith was borrowed from someone else. And I think sometimes we need to watch out for, especially if we come from a faith family, to understand that at some point your faith needs to become your own. You can't borrow it from someone else. Jesus tells a parable about this, about 10 bridesmaids. 5 have oil and 5 do not. The groom comes. The 5 who don't have oil say, hey, can we borrow your oil? And the 5 who have oil say, no, you can't. We can't do it. You have to go to the oil supplier yourself to learn about having your own oil. In other words, there comes to be a point where whoever you are, your faith has to be somewhat independent than those around you. Now, it's not bad to borrow the faith of other people, but at some point, you need to become what I call a self-feeder. You know, if you have little kids around, you feed them. You are responsible for feeding them. And if you don't feed them, they will starve. They will die. But as your kids get older, you're trying to learn how to help them self-feed. Maybe at first you have them hold a spoon with you and they begin to self-feed. But at some point, your kids ideally grow up into teenagers or adults where while you could actually sleep in, they'll come downstairs, open the fridge or open the cupboard and get their own breakfast. They become responsible for their own feeding. They become self-feeders. Brothers and sisters, the same is true for you in church. The church is here to help. You have maybe family, biological or spiritual family, who are helping you. But at some point, you have to feel responsible for your own spiritual feeding that's independent of your church family and independent of your biological family. In other words, if both biological and spiritual family disappeared, there are some practices that you will have to learn on your own that fulfill yourself spiritually. Devotions, reading scripture, a prayer life. What we find in the book of Judges is that people depended on this one person for their faith, but when that person was gone, they starved and went to other faiths. So we learn that it's very important that you actually not borrow someone else's faith, but learn to be a self-feeder. Here's the last thing I want to say, and then we'll go into the more practicals about what we can do, is that faith transference to next generations really requires God's help. We see that God raised up judges in verse 16 who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. We see that when God sees that people are far from him, he takes initiative and he actually pursues us to bring us back. God still shows mercy in the midst of our flakiness. Okay, that was a lot about what we learned from the book of Judges about faith transference again across generations. I want to really now just use the remainder of the time talking about what can we do? What are 4 practices you and I can do to pass on our faith to either biological next generations or spiritual next generations? Here's the first one: personal renewal. There's got to be a sense of renewal in your own life. Here's the good news, that there's already been studies on faith transference across generations. A gentleman named Vern Bankston, who historically actually comes from our denomination, wrote a book called Families and Faith: How Religion is Passed Down Across Generations. What he did, he was a professor at USC, and he began a study of 350 families that he started interviewing starting in 1969, and he tracked them all the way to 2008. And he tracked which kids, and in some cases, which grandkids took on the faith of their parents, and he found that there were some trends of what helped and didn't help. And some families, actually, he was able to track across 4 generations. One of the first things he says, and he knows, is like nothing beats authentic faith in someone. If you want to transfer your faith to maybe your biological family members or your people in your church who are younger than you, he's like, nothing beats an authentic faith where you have personal practices that are sincere, that are central, and that are readily observable. When you are just living an authentic faith and it actually translates into how you behave, how you live out both your devotional life and your church participation and your community service life, if you're just the real deal and living it, there's nothing that beats that. I remember when I was younger, I took this nature hike and we came across rocks that had dried algae on it. This algae was gray, maybe even black. And our guide took some water and poured water on the rock where this algae was. And all of a sudden it went from gray and black to bright green. And in the same way, the best thing you can do is to be kind of re-watered in your faith and to have a personal renewal in your faith. When you have God renew your faith over and over again, you're setting yourself up for being a great person who passes on faith to your kids, grandkids, and your spiritual family. But that's not enough. Just having personal faith is not enough. He goes on, and in his study, he realizes there's another component to this that adds to the ability, to the practices of passing on your faith. And the second one is this: relational warmth. A sense of relational warmth, a sense of closeness as warmth and warmth with those who you're trying to influence. He writes, parents who are warm and loving are more likely to pass on the faith than those that are distant and authoritarian. In other words, there's got to be a proximity and a warmth with those to whom you want to influence. If you want to influence your kids or grandkids, not only do you want to be renewed and have an authentic faith that has practical, observable ramifications, but you also want to be in proximity where your relationship with them is warm. Youth leaders, people who are working with kids, this is also true in our church family. Not only do we want to have a revitalized faith, but we want to be in proximity and have warmth with those around us, so that this transference comes through proximity and relationship. Now, this study also showed that a distant and authoritarian relationship was almost an assurance that faith would not be transferred. And an authoritarian faith is, here's what you need to do and have to do. And warmth actually allows people to figure things out on their own. You're saying who you are, you're saying why you believe, you're saying why you behave, you're explaining your decisions, but you're also giving people space to figure it out on their own, to ask questions, even make mistakes. It's that warmth that creates an environment so that people know they can go to you when trouble comes. I was cooking a dish this past week, and it was a really fun dish. The ingredients were potatoes and onions and carrots and bell peppers and mushrooms, and you put it all over time on a skillet, and you're kind of grilling it over time to cook. But there's one more ingredient that adds a lot of flavor, and it was apple slices. But the recipe was very specific. Please do not add the apple slices while your skillet is still over the flame. If you do that, the apples will get way too mushy for the dish. So here's the solution. Take your skillet with all these ingredients off the fire, off the grill, and then you add the add the apple slices to that afterwards and just stir them. And let the apples get warm by transference of heat from the other ingredients. I think spiritual warmth and relational warmth is the same way. If you're too authoritarian and you just kind of put people in the fire and you force it, it's not going to go well. But if you expect carrots to just, why do I keep saying carrots? If you expect apples to just get warm by themselves, that's not going to work either. There's this sense that as you're doing life, you include the apples, you include the slices so that there is warmth that naturally happens. That's what we're looking for in our church life and our biological family life, an authentic faith and just a side-by-side relational warmth that there's some transference that happens, but there's enough room that people form their own faith. Here's the third thing. Church family inclusion. Not only do you need a personal renewal, not only do you need relational warmth, but there's a sense of you need to be part of a church family, an inclusional community where people are not just observing you, but they're observing many people who are practicing their faith together. See, sometimes when we think of passing on our faith, we think we're a Michelangelo. You know, Michelangelo spent 4 years working on his statue of David, and it was this laborious chipping away at perfection, trying to form this perfect image of a perfect person. And some of us as parents or people who are in ministry where we're trying to shape the next generation, sometimes we think, oh man, it's all up to me to chisel out the perfect person who loves God. I found that that's not really how it works. There's another way to shape. If you take a gem or an unformed or rough gem, when you first look at it, it looks pretty ugly. But the way you get the real gem is you put it in a tumbler. And to this tumbler, you add some grit and water, and you turn on the tumbler, and it goes on for days, sometimes weeks. And over time, because of the rub and the grit and the grinding, what happens is when you're all done, you open up the grinder, you actually have this beautiful gem because it's been affected by so many other elements in the grinder. I find that discipleship is much more like this. Influence is much more like this. You're not the only influence, and you ought not to be the only influence. You're the primary influence, maybe, but you're not the only. But one of the best gifts you can give to those you want to influence is an active involvement in a church community that where people are rubbing shoulders against many, many people. So when I see things like Breakaway, where it's multi-generational, I think this is it. When I hang out at family or Bible study functions where we invite our family and our kids and our spouses, and we're all hanging out together, that's it. So I just want to encourage you, parents, that it's not just your personal renewal, it's not just your relational warmth, but it really is your church family immersion. Jesus made disciples in community. Notice that he had 12 people, that they were rubbing against each other and influencing each other as well. And we belong to a family of God. We are brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts and grandparents to each other. And the more that we include ourselves in our church community and bring along others, the more we're going to see faith transference happen. Here's the last thing I want to say. We can do all these things. We can have a personal, revitalized faith. We can have relational warmth. We can be involved in church community, but there's no guarantee. In the end, this is a God thing. And the last thing is we have to have trust in a faithful God. Proverbs 21:31 says this, "The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but victory rests with the Lord." You know, we can do all that we can. We can prepare a horse for battle, but at the end, we have to step back and go, but God, ultimately the victory belongs to you. We can do our part. Our job is just to be faithful. But where we can relax and just kind of believe that God is at work is we just pray and say, God, I did what I could do, but really, God, it's really up to you. You do the rest. And so as we're being faithful, we can go to bed each night and sleep well because we know that God is the one who takes the initiative. He's the Redeemer. Now, as we go into Ruth, there's a concept in Ruth that we're going to see over and over again. And the concept is that of redeeming, of being a redeemer. This idea of redeeming is the idea of paying a price to rescue someone, to free them from some type of bondage or slavery. We see this in the Old Testament, that if people in Israel got into so much poverty, they were able to sell themselves to the person they owed money to in exchange for the money they had to pay. And what was cool is that relatives were allowed to redeem each other. So if you saw a brother or sister, an aunt or uncle who had to sell themselves, if you had enough money, you can go to this, quote, slave owner and pay money so that they would be redeemed. You would pay a ransom for their redemption. In the book of Ruth, we're going to see this. But really what the big thing is, the theme we're going to see is that Jesus actually becomes our ransom. In Mark 10:45, it says that, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." As we see in Judges, God is a rescuer. He is a redeemer. So as we try to influence the next generation, know also that God is at work, that he takes upon him to pay a ransom for us to see him bring people to us. Okay, church, so that's our challenge right now as we go into the book of Ruth, is to think of how are we going to pass on our faith, go through personal renewal, practice relational warmth, immerse yourself in church community, but then in the end, pray to a faithful God and to trust that he is at work. God bless you guys.
I'm caught up in your presence. I just wanna sit here at your feet, caught up in this holy moment. I never wanna leave. Oh, I'm not here for blessings. Jesus, you don't owe me anything more than anything that you can do. I just want you. I'm sorry when I've just gone through the motions, and I'm sorry when I just sang another song. Take me back to where we started. I open up my heart to you. And I'm sorry when I've come with my agenda, and I'm sorry when I forgot that you're enough. Take me back to where we started. I open up my heart to you. I'm caught up in your presence. I Nothing else will do. I just want you. Nothing else. Nothing else. Nothing else will do. Sing that with me. I just want you. Nothing else. Nothing else. Nothing else will do. I just want you. Nothing else. Nothing else. Nothing else will do. I just want you. Nothing else. Nothing else. Nothing else will do. I just want you. Nothing else. Nothing else. Nothing else will do. Declare it out. Come on. I just want you. Nothing else. Nothing else. Jesus. Nothing else will do. I just want you. Nothing else. Nothing else. Nothing else will do. I just want you. I just want you. Sitting in here, sitting at your feet. We come to you, Jesus. We come to you. I'm caught up in your presence. I just wanna sit here at your feet. I'm caught up in this holy moment. I never want to leave. Oh, I'm not here for blessings. Jesus, you don't owe me anything more than anything that you can do. I just want you. Amen.
Thank you so much for worshiping with us today. Just a reminder, make sure you take some time and fill out our online connection card at ucov.com/online and fill out that survey you received this week. We want to make sure that we are shepherding you well and keeping you up to date with all the things in our online community. We also want to say thank you to everyone who gives regularly to UCC. Your financial giving supports everything we do here, from supporting our global outreach workers to even the production of this online service. So if UCC is your home church and you want to partner with us in giving, or maybe you're new and you would like to make a one-time gift, we welcome you to join us in supporting the ministry work that we do both here at home and abroad. So if God leads you to give to UCC today, simply text the word GIVE to the number on your screen. You can also automate your giving and give online anytime at ucov.com/give. You know, we say this every week, but another way you can partner with us in ministry is by sharing this video. A simple message on social media, an email, or a quick text could be the beginning of a family member or friend or even a neighbor coming to know Christ. So we encourage you, just simply copy the link to this video and paste it in a message and send it to someone that God may be laying on your heart. And if you need help sharing this video, you can text share to the number on your screen, and we'd love to help you with that. Thanks again for being here online with us today. And we hope you join us next week as we continue in our series through the book of Ruth. Now, receive this benediction. University Covenant Church. May you find ways to continually renew your faith, authentically live out your faith, and share your faith with a younger generation. May God speak to you this week and show you his goodness to share with those around you. Go in peace.